In the chapter we are studying, Sri Aurobindo is describing the false identification with which the soul identifies with the body, with the dynamo of life energies, and the whirl of life energies and the dynamo of the mind. And while universal matter, life and mind are real, and while within that individual knots of matter, life and mind are real, the exclusive identification of the soul with these things is a false identification. We therefore need to find some means to disengage from this false identification, recover ourselves as we truly are. The means for that, Sri Aurobindo describes as it is formulated in the traditional approach of the yoga of knowledge. There is a negative and a positive method of the discipline, and in each there is a concentration of the consciousness. So in the negative method, one begins by dissociating from the body. I am not the body, and concentrate on this knowledge that I am not the body, renouncing the attachment of the soul to the physical, get rid of the body sense. And then I am not the life, and by concentration on this knowledge, renunciation of attachment to the vital movements and desires, get rid of the life sense. And then I am not the mind, the motion, the sense, the thought. Perhaps by degrees, by gradations, each of these three. Concentrating on this knowledge, renunciation of the mental activities, we get rid of mind sense. And at that point, he says, having created a gulf between ourselves and these things which we had identified with, the veils progressively fall away from us, and spontaneously the sense of the self, the presence of the self begins to become visible again in degrees. At that point, the positive method begins. We put our full concentration on that which is beginning to dawn on our consciousness. I am that, the pure, the eternal, the self-blissful. Here again, Sri Aurobindo describes three facets to the identification with that: the pure, the eternal, the self-blissful. And they are natural starting points depending on our temperament. In fact, depending on whether our temperament is more oriented to entering in relation with the essential or with the permanent, or with the aspect of the bliss, of the play, of the delight of manifestation. And so the first concentration is on the pure, because there we automatically and most easily disengage from limitations of form, of name, of finiteness, of impermanence. Because that which is pure is always behind in the essence. And we continue to concentrate on that which is more essential, more true, more pure. And in this way, we approach the self as that which is the pure essence of all things. There is the other side, which is the sense of permanence. When all the movements of body, life, and mind are in activity, in change, in process of movement, that remains as a backdrop, eternal, free. And so we dwell on the sense of the eternal, standing back, supporting. Or in all this manifestation, movement, the play of the force, there is something which secretly takes delight of it. And we dwell on that which is delight, which is the bliss, which is self-blissful, of which the play is a representation or an expression. And all three can merge into a single experience. I am that. And concentrating our thought on that, concentrating our being on that. So at first there's the mind dwelling on. Mind awareness is dwelling on that. But there's a point where even the sense of mind is fading out, because that's one of the veils which we have been gradually dissociating from. What remains at that point is sheer existence. I am in my being. And this being leans into self and begins to lose itself into self, lose all sense of separateness. Even when we first experience the sense of I am being, who has mind or not, at that point there is a sense I am which can be relatively narrow. It has no particular sense of boundary, and yet it has sense of limitation. But as it enters in relation with the self, it is the vast against which it exists like a drop of the ocean, and it lets itself merge into that. And so we renounce, as a result, individual existence and cosmos. So in this way, by the dual method, negative and positive, we find one part which dissociates and another part which concentrates on that which is true and real, and we attain to the true self. We are freed from the false identifications. And another positive method, which he also lists from the Raja Yogic approach, is concentrating on the thought of the Brahman, shutting out from us all other ideas and varied external and internal existences of mind. Mind itself shuts down, therefore, in the silence of the mind, and the emergence begins to take place. As you can see, these are variations of a similar principle, which is to bring to silence the activity of the mind and then to dwell upon that which transcends. There can be a mix of these experiences. There is even a continuity in the spectrum of the experiences. And we settle in some inexpressible, deepest trance of the being, into some absolute existence. And here, Sri Aurobindo now offers the criticism and the limitation of this. Not so much the practice, but the nature of the experience to which we have entered, on which we have concentrated. He says this discipline is evidently a self-centered and exclusive inner movement which gets rid of the world by denying it in thought and shutting the eyes of the soul to it in vision. We read this text last time, but we reread now more from the experiential aspect and to explore some of the fine distinctions that he makes in the description. So here there is, from the mind, there is a denial in the thought. But in the more essential part of us, there is a deliberate shutting eyes of the soul to this vision. But in spite of our denial and closing of our eyes, the universe is there as a truth in God, even though the individual soul may have shut its eyes to it. And the self is there in the universe really and not falsely, supporting all that we have rejected, truly immanent in all things, really embracing the individual in the universal, as well as embracing the universe in that which exceeds and transcends it. And so here, Sri Aurobindo is using a vocabulary and fine distinctions which we now should begin to appreciate, because it will lead to a very important recognition of three different ways of knowing the Brahman, and eventually the merging of all these three into a single whole experience. So here he's using the word, the individual soul may have shut its eyes to it, to the world. Even then, the universe is there as a truth in God. This is one side of the experience. The other side of the experience is the self is there in the universe really and not falsely, supporting everything. So we have three things: individual soul, God, and self. And each of these is described in relation to the universe. The individual soul is so far the center of awareness that I experience myself to be. And so this can change. When it's identifying with the surface nature, it is the desire soul. When it turns within in the inner consciousness, it can go deeper still. It can merge in self. But this fluctuating center of awareness we are describing as the individual soul. The individual soul, when it concentrates in this way and goes deeper and deeper, may have shut its eyes to the universe, but still the universe is there. But where is it? It's not outside only, because that could be an illusion. The universe is there as a truth in God. And so we have now God, universe, and then the individual soul refusing universe, which is a truth in God. And this God term, of course, being English, we must see its original Sanskrit term more correctly expressed as Ishvara, the Lord, which we recognize as a personality, a being who is conscious, contrasting with the idea of self or Atman, which is impersonal. We do not have a sense of personality with it. It is there, static. It simply is. It does not do anything. Whereas God is conscious being, individual, even though cosmic or even transcending cosmos. You can enter in relation with him and he relates to you, to the whole cosmos as a totality, to any part or aspect of the cosmos, and to each thing in the cosmos as Lord. And you have a personal relationship there, and also an action which is personal. And so we must understand the difference, as well as what is it that unites the sense of Atman and Ishvara, self and God. So we'll come to this shortly. Meanwhile, there's this individual soul who's been doing something. He has been disengaging, separating from what? From nature. And this status of standing back, observing, is Purusha, against which we have the play of nature, Prakriti. So we have three different terms being used now: Ishvara, Atman, and Purusha. There's a whole chapter in the Life Divine where Sri Aurobindo shows the relationship between these three and how Brahman expresses himself or can be known in these three aspects. And then he leads you through a process of understanding but also experience of how these three merge into a single experience of the divine. which also is the goal that this whole chapter is taking us to. Sri Aurobindo, as I mentioned, is criticizing that experience which we saw of the soul merging into the absolute. He is criticizing the limitation of that experience. The method itself can be used for a still greater experience. But the experience here articulated is one of withdrawal in abandonment of something, and that is abandoning the universe, which is a truth in God. And therefore its abandonment is a loss, a limitation of our experience. And it continues even though we have shut our eyes to it. So he asks the question rhetorically. Before that. So self is also there in the universe, really and not falsely. It was our experience while in the universe, it was our experience also that self is immanent in all things, supporting all things from within. So it is there, immanent in all things, and really embracing the individual in the universal, as well as embracing the universe in that which exceeds and transcends it. So the self is described in three stations: transcending, universal, and then inhabiting individually, immanent. And this is also a reality. And so he says rhetorically, he asks, what shall we do with this eternal self in this persistent universe? So he has placed universe and self as next to each other. One represents the consciousness which supports, which inhabits, or even which enjoys, and then the other is the consciousness which is the movement of the force, the energy which creates the forms which the self inhabits. And this duality is something also which we need to discuss, and we will come to that shortly. Why at all there are these two stations, and they seem almost opposed to each other. So what shall we do with this self and universe, which we see encompassing us every time we come out of the trance of inner meditation? So while in inner meditation we may abandon all this and say the universe ceases to be, I am in the absolute, but when you come out, it's all there. And what do you do with it? And the ascetic path of knowledge, he says, has its solution. And we read this, the discipline for the soul looking out on the universe. And we are taught in the ascetic path to approach in a certain way through specific steps by which we will end in the realization that the universe is an illusion. And the method is very simple, it's very beautiful, very elegant. It starts by conceiving of the all-encompassing, immanent, and all-constituting self in the image of the ether, in which all forms are, which is in all forms, and of which all forms are made. Now these three things are extremely important. There are three ways of relating to, or putting in relation, the self with the universe. One is the self is in all things. Second is all things in the self, and all things as the self. And these three, you will recall, are described in the Isha Upanishad. And Sri Aurobindo is drawing extensively on that reference in the way he articulates things here. You will recall the verses 14. Sorry. Yes. The verses 6 and 7. He who sees everywhere the self in all existences, and all existences in the self, shrinks not thereafter from aught. And verse 7, he in whom it is the self-being that has become all existences, that are becomings, for he has the perfect knowledge, how shall he be deluded? Whence shall he have grief who sees everywhere oneness? So it is in this third step that there is the completion and the true sense of the oneness. The first two are entry points, and the three together make for the completion. And so this is what we are seeing, the ether as self. We are asked to dwell on the idea of self as an ether inside which all this exists, which is in all things, of which everything is formed, but by what? By whom? And here we are taught, in that ether, cosmic life and mind move as the breath of things, an atmospheric sea in the ethereal, and constitute from it all these forms. But what they constitute are merely name and form and not realities. We are asked to meditate on this idea. Now you see the process which is taught. It's very simple and elegant, but in it is an implied bias already. The starting point of the bias was that this self is like an ether, yes, out of which everything is made, etc. But mind and life are creating something within it which is not real. So there is a cosmic life and mind moving as breath of things. So they are both dynamizing powers. And they, out of this atmospheric sea in the ethereal, as part of this atmospheric sea in the ethereal, make out of the ether the forms. So mind plays a role in creating the form, life plays a role in creating the form, and their each contribution leads to these two terms, name and form. Okay, so we're going into some detail. Last time we had read it, we didn't dwell upon these ideas, but this is extremely important to understand the actual experience as well as the process of the formation. Mind takes the substance of ether, which is everything, which is everywhere, and upon it imprints the sense of a meaning. And so we call that name, nama in Sanskrit. Life energy takes that meaning and creates a whirl around it, repeating around the meaning. So there is the meaning at the center. The whirl could have been around anything. There could be two different meanings, let's say, and two different whirls. The whirls are similar, but because they form around the meaning, they express meaning in the whirl. And because they continue a repetitive whirl, they create appearance of a sustained form. So life energy creates form, mind creates name. Now there's a very important distinction between these two, and we'll digress slightly to dwell on the meaning of it experientially. We have to understand not just as technical terms of philosophy or metaphysics, but things which we see from within ourselves as realities. When we were children, in school, we had already been taught French. We had a vocabulary which was more French, less English already. We all, of course, knew Hindi. We knew our mother tongue, etc. And there was a young girl who had come in our class. She had just entered at that point. It must have been age 8 or 9. And we had in our class an aquarium, and there were fish swimming. And this girl stared at those fish for a long time. And then she pointed to that. She had just learned a few words of French in an accelerated course because she was not with us from kindergarten. And she pointed and said, "Qu'est-ce que c'est ça?" What is this? And we all laughed. And the teacher she chided us and she said, "Don't laugh. She's actually very intelligent. She's asking what this is." And then the teacher answered, "Ça c'est poisson. Ça c'est, this is fish." And for many years I thought about this. I thought I had to be stupid not to realize why she was more intelligent. But I still couldn't get it. What the teacher answered was a name, a word. And the girl was satisfied and the teacher was satisfied. This is fish. But I still don't know what it is. I've been given a label to stick on top of it. But that's not it, isn't it? What it is does not change whether you call it fish or you call it poisson or you call it mach. It doesn't make any difference. It is what it is. And so to me the whole question was weird. The answer the teacher gave was weird, and the teacher's labeling that whole exercise as intelligence was also weird. And here I'm sharing this because this goes at the heart of our experience of reality. When we are faced with new ideas and we don't have a terminology for it, The idea itself exists in us. We just don't know words. In mathematics, they will give you terms like commutative, associative. And if you don't know the jargon, you'll say, my God, this fellow is so intelligent. He's using terms which I don't understand. I don't know these things. I'm stupid. I have not studied. I'm not educated. But if you look at the concept behind, they're simple concepts. They're obvious to you. You don't need intelligence to know them. They're already there in your mind. I've just given a vocabulary to describe an experience that you already have. Right? Commutative means you can put this before that or that before this. You can exchange and it's the same thing. If A is equal to B, then B is equal to A. It is commutative. Big deal. You've just given a complex word for a very simple idea. Right? So this naming in a language is not what is described here when we say name and form. It is the concept behind the recognition of the idea, which is what we mean by name. So in the idea of name and form, nama and rupa, when it was taken from the Vedic and Upanishadic philosophy and teaching to the West, it was at the time of the period of enlightenment. They read these texts and then created equivalent terms. Noumen is the term used, which indicates some essential isness of the thing what it is by itself. And you'll find this idea in the biblical tradition when Adam is asked to name, or he meets all the creatures of the world and names them. What does it mean he's naming them? What's the big deal? What language is he using? He could have used Hebrew or he could have used Sumerian. It makes no difference, right? But the idea is deeper. It is the act of giving the sense of meaning, an essential meaning which distinguishes this from that. The fish is an idea. How many fish are there? Types of fish, species of fish, shapes of fish, sizes of fish, individualizations of fish, infinite. But the whole totality of those infinite variations is held in a single idea, conceptually named fish. Now this fish has 2 fins, that fish has 4 fins. This fish has an aqua lung, it can breathe in water, that fish can breathe in air also. That fish cannot breathe in water. You can have all variations of possible and still they're all in the same category, fish or idea of fish. And somehow that is different from idea of snake or tortoise, which are not fish. And they have something distinctive and it is not so fixed on the form. We struggle to find definitions in terms of form to distinguish one from the other. But conceptually we know what we mean when we say fish. Okay, so it is at that level that we use the word naming, nama. And when Adam gives name, Adam here is the universal consciousness, the male, the one who stands as the Purusha. And he looks at all the play of the forms of Prakriti and the flows of energy and the possibilities which, and we will shortly discuss this, secretly are willed by the presiding consciousness. And in the act of willing them and giving form, there is a concept, an intention held, and the naming is that, giving a name to it, which characterizes, distinguishes, and holds an essential idea around which all the innumerable variations of form will be now described and expressed by the play of life force. Rupa, form. Nama and Rupa. Rupa is infinite variation. But all those infinite variations can somehow merge into this nama, the name, which is holding an essential idea behind, and it's at the level of the mind, not of energy. And then even at that level, there can be a further dissolution into something which is essential. When you remove the naming, then everything lapses back into the underlying substance of the ether, out of which by naming you brought out concept, into which by whirl of energy you gave form. Nama and Rupa are the steps, the stages by which out of something formless, form is expressed. So, this, you see that, read the text now again and you see what it's capturing in experience. In that ether, cosmic life and mind move as the breath of things, an atmospheric sea in the ethereal, that's the breath of things, of these two working, and constitute from it, from the ether, and constitute from it all these forms. But what they constitute are merely name and form and not realities. The form of the pot we see is a form of earth only and goes back into the earth. Earth, a form resolvable into the cosmic life. The cosmic life, a movement that falls to rest in the silent, immutable ether. And you see the chain by which we can stand back and as if dissolve into unreality each of these things. So the form of the pot is the rupa. The nama, the name is pot, concept of pot, idea of pot. But that is formed out of what? It's form of earth. And so if you dissolve that pot, form, and idea of pot, you have only earth, universal earth. And the earth itself is form resolvable into cosmic life. It is energy whirling which creates this appearance of substance of matter. And there's only life force which whirls. And the life force was given an idea form by which it took a particular orientation to create that earth and pot of earth. You withdraw that idea form, you withdraw the life force, and the cosmic life is a movement that falls to rest in the silent, immutable ether. And remember, we started with the idea that this is the reality. This is the self. And that bias now is justified finally in settling in self, against which the whole universe begins to fade away as unreal. So he says, concentrating on this knowledge, rejecting all phenomenon and appearance, we come to see the whole as an illusion of name and form in the ether that is Brahman. Now you see here again we have made a choice. We made a choice that we concentrate on this knowledge, that this ether is the underlying truth, all else is illusory, phenomenon, appearance. And then we make a choice to reject phenomenon and appearance. You see here the bias is very important. We have chosen a line of experience which is justified, as all experiences are justified, which is profound, which is liberating, but which is incomplete because of our bias, choosing to separate something and deny the rest. And so we come back to Brahman. The world then, he says, the whole of the world, it becomes unreal to us. And the universe becoming unreal, the immanence becomes unreal. And there is only the self upon which our mind has falsely imposed the name and form of the universe. So Nama Rupa is not only an individual but at level of universe. Name universe, idea of universe is also a Nama. And form of universe is also a Rupa. And all that mind has falsely imposed on self, which is now the only reality of Brahman. Thus are we justified in the withdrawal of the individual self into the absolute. And we can say, now I abandon all this illusory formation which my mind falsely imposed on the backdrop of the self, and I merge into the absolute. It's justified because it's all the rest is unreal anyway. So I have as if started by assuming that I'm going to make the universe unreal against the self, and then I come to the conclusion and the justification in the experience because I followed a process which would lead to that experience, and then the withdrawal is justified. So we see now, briefly digressing, there are still technical problems, philosophical and metaphysical issues here. We could ask, where did this mind come which could falsely impose name and form of the universe on the self? Right? What gives mind the power to create this false action of creating something so gigantic, so wonderful, massive, so real seeming? So obviously there is some power creative in mind or behind mind which is as extraordinary as the self, against which the soul false image of name and form can be imposed, isn't it? And how is it that in that essentiality of self, something so false could be so powerfully created? Is falsehood as powerful as the backdrop of the reality of the self? In fact, this is the direction that the conclusion we are taught to bring. We say, Maya, a power which creates false illusions. But Sri Aurobindo again questions there, what is this power of Maya? Where did it come from? What gives it such an extraordinary power? And we fall short. There is no answer. And so he exclaims in the Life Divine that even when we have attained to that highest liberation of an exclusive character, Maya laughs at us. I have tricked you even in that final liberation. That we'll come to a deeper understanding of these things shortly. And so Sri Aurobindo says, even after this, something is missing. Still the self goes on with its imperishable aspect of immanence. Even after you have come to this final conclusion, everything is illusion, it goes on. Its immutable aspect of divine envelopment, its endless trick of becoming each thing and all things. Our detection of the cheat and our withdrawal do not seem to affect one tittle either the self or the universe. This formulation, which also we have read, has a lot of very fine suggestions, which we now dwell on. The self he describes in three aspects: imperishable aspect of immanence, immutable aspect of divine envelopment, endless trick of becoming each thing and all things. And in all three aspects, you see the permanence: imperishable, immutable, endless. So what is imperishable? The immanence. You can change everything, change the form, break everything you can, but the immanence of the self informs. It inhabits everything. That remains imperishable. The form perishes. The self filling the form is imperishable. There is a permanence to this aspect of supporting forms. Second is immutable aspect of divine envelopment. So this is the embrace of the self around, not from within, but from around. All things, but also embracement of the universe by the self. And that is immutable. As self embraces universe, the universe goes on changing. But the self-embracing is unchanging. This is again an argument Sri Aurobindo uses, because remember, through our mind, because we are mental beings, we have to touch something which is above mind, beyond mind, which mind cannot even comprehend. So it seems to be something of a challenge. And yet there are movements of the mind which come close enough that allow us to make a passage and a transition to an experience above mind. And one of the arguments Sri Aurobindo uses to help the mind recognize the reality of self, imperishable, immutable. He says, look at the whole universe. Everything is changing. Everything is whirling. Everything is in a flow. But the totality of it never changes. You can take out energy from here, but it only goes elsewhere. You can take out matter from here, it only goes elsewhere. You can break up matter, it only changes form and moves elsewhere. But in the totality, there is nothing diminishing. Nothing being added, nothing being taken out in the infinity of the whole. And so if you stand back from the idea of universe itself and look at the universe as a whole, that whole is unchanging, while within it everything is changing. So automatically, in the very act of recognizing a universe of change and flow of form, we are compelled to recognize some underlying thing which is unchanging, which is permanent, which is immutable, while everything else is mutating. So you cannot have concept of mutation without the backdrop of immutability. And so here he uses this term, immutable aspect of divine envelopment. The envelopment itself of the self-embracing universe is an immutable aspect. Nothing changes, while everything inside the embrace is changing. And third, endless trick of becoming each thing and all things. So remember, we saw the third part of the experience of the self as becoming all things. So everything is self in becoming, but the becoming is changing. And each time that it changes, it is still self becoming this, now becoming the next, and now becoming the next unendingly. So it is endless. The trick of becoming all things is an endless trick. And again, it reminds us of the permanence of the self in the activity of the becoming of each thing, and in the activity of the becoming of all things in their totality and as a whole. Now, these two distinctions are important because individual and universal are two facets of the transcendent, two aspects of its play. Individual can exist without universal. It would be in perfect isolation. You can conceive of fish, elephant, in abstraction. It doesn't need a universe in which the fish has to exist, isn't it? You can conceive of universe in totality with no forms in it. So the universality and individuality are essentially two different facets of the same one transcending consciousness. But when the transcendent brings the two together, it places individuality within universality, then there can be play of interaction. I can have elephant in pure individuality, fish in pure individuality. They'll never meet. They just exist. But it's only when I put both of them in relation within universality, then now elephant and fish can have some relationship. So the transcendent expresses universality as one aspect, expresses individuality and innumerable infinite individuality. But when it brings the two together, universality offers the field of the play. Individuality offers form of the play. And so the two together make for this experience. So the endless trick of becoming each thing as well as all things is still an endless trick. The self somehow holds its imperishable aspect, immutable aspect, and endless trickery. And that's the permanence. The self goes on. Our detection of the cheat and our withdrawal do not seem to affect one tittle, either the self or the universe. And the word tittle, tiniest bit, we would expect if someone suddenly attained to self-realization and recognized the world's illusoriness, the whole world would shake up, isn't it? Because suddenly it is exposed, the trick is exposed. Nothing, not even a tiniest tittle changes. Everything goes on as it is. Okay, you've abandoned, so what? It damn cares, as if. This is very important to recognize, because for the person having that experience, there can be a shattering experience. The whole universe is dissolved. The mother describes there's a state of consciousness, she says, in which the entire universe could be extinguished just in a puff, and still it wouldn't matter. When you break out into something like that, it's like the whole universe shakes, becomes unreal, and breaks down like an illusion. And at that point, for you, it is not earth shaking, but it is universe shaking. Everything is gone, and there is only that. And yet you come out of that experience, reconnect with your senses, nothing has changed. Not a tittle. So something here is hiding as a secret. And Sri Aurobindo is pointing to that secret, and we must realize that secret. Otherwise our realization is incomplete. So, must we not then know also what it is that thus persists, superior to our acceptance and rejection, and too great, too eternal to be affected by it? In other words, even in our rejection, something continued with that same totality and intensity of eternity, greatness, that it didn't matter, that we actually shattered the whole universe in our liberation. Here too, there must be some invincible reality at work, And the integrality of knowledge demands that we shall see and realize it. Something missing in our experience so far, and there's a requirement to realize it. Otherwise, it may prove that our own knowledge and not the Lord in the universe was the cheat and the illusion. And this is the reality, in fact, that it is in our knowledge that the cheat and illusoriness existed, not in the Lord and his manifestation in the universe. So now comes the correction or the completion of the previous experiences. Now we can see this as a correction. We can also see it as a completion. We've brought this idea before, and it's worth reminding ourselves of it. In the integral vision, nothing is essentially wrong. Nothing is essentially wasted. Everything has its place. In the past, there has been a powerful impetus to realize this illusoriness of the universe. We've all been through it in previous lives in which we have sought the Spirit, because it happened everywhere on earth. And although that was the primary impetus of the last 2000 years, there were still corners within which the truth of the other side was held, but in tiny centers, just so that it is not totally lost in humanity. But the bulk of it was in this realization of the illusoriness of the universe. And it was necessary because the way we know the universe is illusory. And this is the point Mother makes. It would be wrong to say, she says, that the universe is an illusion. But what is true is our way of seeing it is illusory. And in order to be free from that illusoriness of our way of seeing, we must pass through the experience of complete dissociation from that illusion in which we saw things. Completely be free of the illusion. And then only we can re-engage from a deeper truth. If halfway through, we have not completely freed from the illusion, we brought in the idea of the truth of things, we might still get an undigested, incomplete realization of the truth of things, because the illusoriness would still be there as an undercurrent. This, in fact, is a problem we are facing today all over the world. It's taken this form where something of the truth of the universe, the reality of the divine manifestation, is now pressing upon humanity for recognition. But we have not yet fully freed ourselves from the idea of illusoriness. And so you will see everywhere the idea of spirituality still is abandoning the world, abandoning life, accepting poverty, weakness, incapacity as spiritual, as superior. And that somehow creates a kind of an indigestion and a confusion. So there's a whole struggle going on. But the illusoriness of the world having been acquired, we are now free from the past ideas. We need to re-engage from a new foundation and still get free of the idea of illusoriness. So there's a whole struggle going on. How are we then to regain the true perception? And that's the secret he gives us here. 2 steps, which we read last time. First, concentrate again now. And now if you see it this way, it is not only a correction for the illusory experience, but it is a completion now of the cycle of separating and re-embracing the universe from a new station. So we must accept that whatever we went through in the past and the illusoriness of things was necessary, was useful, but it is an incomplete realization, and now we must bring back the completeness. And what do we concentrate on? And we must yet concentrate once again and see and realize, and must know the self as the one existence who is both the soul of all and the nature of all, at once Purusha and Prakriti, and so able both to express himself in all these forms of things and to be all these formations. Otherwise, we have excluded what the self does not exclude and made a willful choice in our knowledge. So the correction here is something quite unusual. So far, we saw self as our consciousness in its essentiality. Universe, therefore, is not our consciousness. Form, name, and form could therefore be separated from, and they were abandoned as movement of energy, of life, of mind, which all have to somehow fall back into quiescence, silence, and dissolve into that one static self. But if we realize that even those things which are continuing when we withdraw are also self, then the whole picture changes. Remember, each time we withdrew into either illusoriness of the world or into absoluteness and came back, everything continued. And rather than saying this is all illusion and false, we say this also is an aspect, power, expression of self. Therefore, it continues. Therefore, its imperishability. Therefore, its immutability. Therefore, its endless expression in form. So, not only our consciousness was self, but the form and play of nature and the energy and mind, which are part of nature, are also self. So, the way he articulates is very precise. We must yet concentrate once again and see, and we have to see first and then realize. So, this is first a perception and then an identification in the perception. And then in that, you are the knowledge, know the self as the one existence who is both the soul of all and the nature of all. So we have an idea of a single oneness, which is in the soul and essence of things as well as in the nature and form of things. The terms we have used: Purusha, observing consciousness; Prakriti, energy of formation. At once, both are the one existence. So the self is not non-existence. The absolute is not non-existence. That would not be absolute. Absolute includes everything. The definition of the absolute has to be clearly understood. It is not an abandonment of everything. It is a transcendence of everything which includes everything in the process. So non-existence and existence are both facets of the experience of the transcendent, the absolute. And so the absolute is also one existence, even as it is able to be non-existence. It is one existence in which both soul and nature are at once Purusha and Prakriti, and so able to be all these formations, as well as express himself in all these forms of things. So he is not only inside, but he is the formation equally. And if we don't accept this, we have excluded what the self does not exclude, because the self did not exclude nature and power of energy of creation. Therefore, that continues even though we withdrew in our consciousness subjectively in our self. And we would have excluded what the self does not exclude. In other words, we don't know self completely when we take this exclusive approach of withdrawal into oneness, of transcendence, or in dissolution. And we have made a willful choice in our knowledge to exaggerate or to narrow or limit ourselves. Now, with this, I will draw on the text from the Life Divine of the chapter which I referred to earlier. The chapter itself is titled Brahman, Purusha, Ishvara, dash, Maya, Prakriti, Shakti. I see there's a pairing, Brahman and Maya, Purusha and Prakriti, Ishvara and Shakti. Now we have heard these terms, these pairs repeatedly. Sri Aurobindo has used these terms in our discussion. And how exactly are these? After all, there is only one existence. These are three ways in which we can know that one Brahman. Bhagavad Gita, Sri Aurobindo quotes always when he begins a chapter, he draws from brief references to past wisdom traditions which confirm this idea or which point in this direction. So here's a quote from the Bhagavad Gita which says, "Know Purusha and Prakriti to be both eternal without beginning." In the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, one must know Maya as Prakriti and the master of Maya as the great Lord of all. See, already we are getting a sense of how they join. And other quotes which... Okay, we can again from the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. It is the might of the Godhead in the world that turns the wheel of Brahman. Him one must know, the Supreme Lord of all lords, the Supreme Godhead above all Godheads. Supreme too is His Shakti and manifold and natural working of her knowledge and her force. One Godhead, occult in all beings, the inner self of all beings, the all-pervading Absolute, without qualities, the overseer of all actions, the witness, the knower. But the idea that equally His Shakti, she too is supreme. So this chapter basically discusses these three facets of the experience of the Brahman, and it is quite detailed, and he draws on many interesting connections as he pulls together all the threads. But at some point he summarizes it, and that's what I want to get to. He writes, an absolute, eternal and infinite self-existence, self-awareness, self-delight of being that secretly supports and pervades the universe, even while it is also beyond it, is then the first truth of spiritual experience. But this truth of being has at once an impersonal and a personal aspect. It is not only existence, it is the one being, absolute, eternal and infinite. So straight away, when we meet this, we can see it impersonally, we can know it personally. So there is an existence, but there is also being. And then he now takes this as a starting point to show these distinctions. As there are three fundamental aspects in which we meet this reality, so too its power of consciousness appears to us in three aspects. That's the sentence. But in between there is a parenthetical statement. There are three fundamental aspects in which we meet this reality: self, conscious being or spirit, and God, the divine being. So self, conscious being or spirit, and God, the divine being. Or to use the Indian terms, the absolute and omnipresent reality, Brahman, manifests to us as Atman, Purusha, Ishvara. So self is Atman. Notice, when we approach reality by merging our consciousness into it, it is a subjective, internal consciousness that we are going back into its origin. At that point we call it Atman, self, because it is ourselves. The next is conscious being or spirit, Purusha. And this conscious being is the self also entering in relation to the play of form, standing back or existing within the form, secretly supporting within, but it is spirit, it is unchanging, it stands back, conscious, but not the movement of which it is conscious. And the third is Ishvara, God, the divine being, as a conscious being, but also as Lord, as presiding over the whole play, even initiating it or enjoying it. So Atman, Purusha, Ishvara. So too its power of consciousness of this reality, appears to us in three aspects. It is the self-force of that consciousness, conceptively creative of all things, Maya. It is Prakriti, nature or force made dynamically executive, working out all things under the witnessing eye of the conscious being, the self or spirit. Third, it is the conscious power of the divine being, Shakti, which is both conceptively creative and dynamically executive of all the divine workings. These three aspects and their powers base and comprise the whole of existence and all nature. And taken together as a single whole, they reconcile the apparent disparateness and incompatibility of the supracosmic transcendence, the cosmic universality, and the separativeness of our individual existence. So if we do not recognize the unity of these three and in what way they relate, you'll find these three stations to be somehow unconnected: the transcendent, the universal, and the individual. The absolute, cosmic nature and ourselves are linked in oneness by this triune aspect of the one reality. For, taken by itself, the existence of the absolute, the supreme Brahman, would be a contradiction of the relative universe, and our own self-existence would be incompatible with its sole incommunicable reality. So if you say Brahman is purely the transcendent, absolute, then where does this relativity come from, which is contradictory to the absolute? And this is the reason why when you approach through the mind, through metaphysical study, philosophical discussion, you'll end up with all these weird questions which don't have answers, which is the reason why people go on discussing across centuries, across civilizations, not coming to any final conclusion because logic cannot. The reality is transcending logic, that the transcendent is at once inclusive of all that it transcends. The absolute includes all the relativities and possibilities of relativity. Whether it chooses to manifest or not, it includes them always in itself. This mind cannot, it can accept, okay, you say it, but mind cannot conceive. Because the moment you conceive transcendence, you break out of form, and relativities cannot exist. The moment you conceive of relativities, you are in form, transcendence is not possible. But in experience, when your consciousness joins with the transcendent, it includes all that. So the solution is there, experientially knowable. So he continues, but the Brahman is at the same time omnipresent in all relativities. It is the absolute, independent of all relativities, the absolute basing all relativities, the absolute governing, pervading, constituting all relativities. There is nothing that is not the omnipresent reality. In observing the triple aspect and the triple power, we come to see how this is possible. And that's the rest of the chapter of this in the Life Divine. We won't look at that, but we'll just discuss in a very general way the relationship between these three. So you notice here already he is giving you a clue in this description. Brahman, as the absolute, yes, is above all relativities. But Brahman is at the same time omnipresent in all relativities. So that's the first step to understand. He stands above, is free of them, is not them, and yet is present in them in all the relativities. Relativity cannot exist without something behind supporting as an absolute. When you say this is relative to that, you have to conceive of a backdrop in which you can hold these things relative. The backdrop itself cannot be relative. To allow the concept of relativity to exist, there has to be this absoluteness. And you will find in science, we often, in the domain of relativity, especially with Einstein's relativity, this idea came up, which is very much common in also certain formulations of Buddhism, where everything is placed in a relativity, in a flux of relativity, which itself is known against another flux of relativity, which itself is known in a larger flux of relativity unendingly. And it's a trick by which you ignore that the concept of relativity itself presupposes an absolute against which you can say these are all relative. So in the Buddhist formulation, they will not speak of oneness. They will speak of interdependence, which is the sense of oneness. Interdependence in oneness, or a oneness expressed in interdependence, but no absolute sense of oneness. Because oneness would mean against which there is something which is other, and so it is part of the relativity. But this is really a problem of the vocabulary, and Sri Aurobindo clarifies this very quickly. He says, the oneness we speak of the self, is not a unitary oneness where one leads to two. It is a oneness in identity. Well, all the infinity is one in identity. At the same time, one consciousness which is all these things. So, these are all abstract ideas, but if we can dwell on them, it helps us to understand and to unify these disparateness and apparent contradictions of the universe. So he says, Brahman is at the same time omnipresent in all the relativities. Because it is there, the relativities are possible. And then a further degree, it is the absolute independent of all relatives. At the same time, it is the absolute basing all relativities. If it was not there as base, it could not express relativities. And at the same time, the absolute governing, pervading, and constituting all the relativities. So it guides them, it is in them, it makes them. There is nothing that is not the omnipresent reality. So, and this is the way that we have to see the universe and the relationship of the universe and ourselves and our consciousness with the absolute. Now, when we see these three stations, then we understand this vocabulary of Atman, Purusha, Ishvara. So, against the sense of Atman, and let's look at it more from a subjective experience, what it is like. When we speak of Atman, I am consciousness. And as my consciousness goes deeper and deeper, it returns eventually to the permanence, the reality, the one. But this subjectively is disengaging, standing back from all this. As my consciousness merges into the absolute, all this which is relativity is still there. I can choose to dissolve it by refusing to look at it. But if I recognize that it is there, where does it come from? What forms it when I am absolute, when all is the absolute? And the name Maya gives you the clue. Maya, the word comes from Maya, the root in Sanskrit, which means measuring out. Measuring out, and measurement means finiteness. So measuring out to give finite appearance from that which is infinite or absolute. Measuring out to form relativities out of that which is absolute. And so Maya is the power by which the absolute casts the play of relativities out of himself. It is a creative power in the Vedic tradition. It is not a power of deception. In later Vedantic traditions, Maya is described as a power of deception, a cheat, an illusory power, because when our consciousness is thus entangled within the play of finites, with the false identification with mind, life, and body, then this same power is what is creating this false appearance, hiding the reality, the oneness, the absolute behind. And so she appears to us as a deceptive power, a hypnotic power, because she is playing, I forget that I am self. I forget that I am Lord. I forget I am free. I am so fascinated by this play. I am lost in it, trapped in it. And this smoothly brings us to the second vocabulary we used, which is Purusha and Prakriti. I, the consciousness, now entangled, watching, hypnotized, am Purusha. And the play which is going on of this drama of forms and appearances of forms dissolving, forming, dissolving, the moment I try to grasp one and make it permanent, it breaks and turns into something else. This play is Prakriti, which is all that I can see from my witness poise as an individual mental being. But I could similarly disengage and step back from my narrow individuality, open to my universality and be a witness in a universal consciousness, and still I see universal Prakriti playing continuously, this free flow of mind flow, energy flow, by which all these forms are cast. And I watch as the spectator watches the movie on the screen. In my consciousness, when I identify, I lose myself and I think and feel myself a creation of Prakriti, of nature. When I separate myself, I know I am free and I can watch and enjoy the movie from my poise of freedom, but I am not movie. I am not this play. And I can choose to relate to it either as an interesting, fascinating play with some curiosity or a lot of interest, or I can choose to turn away from it and say, not interesting at all. And this brings us smoothly to the third vocabulary, which is the term Ishvara and the Shakti. When I turn away and lose interest in the play of Prakriti, I realize the play begins to fizzle out. As long as I'm enjoying my play of emotions, I am so excited. And of course, as I'm going to go for this most exciting event, it rains and the whole event is cancelled. I am so disappointed. The same intensity of my excitement turns with equal intensity to disappointment. And as I identify and indulge in it, it is there as the drama of nature. But when I stand back and refuse participation, I say, you know what, this is not interesting. It happens, it doesn't happen, not interested. And suddenly that whole thing begins to fizzle out. The drama begins to fizzle out. The excitement or the disappointment begins to fizzle out. And quickly nature tries to offer me something else which might be interesting. And if at that point I say not interesting, she offers something else. The moment I find this interesting and I engage and entangle myself, she grows around it and exaggerates and makes it my drama. But I can not only say not interested and the mind becomes quiet, my emotional drama becomes quiet. I can then say, I want to experience a quiet joy. And I can then will upon the play of nature what I want. And the spectator suddenly realizes that the whole drama is being created for his enjoyment, to fulfill him. And if he does not like something, nature will change it. If he wants something else, she will fulfill it. And he realizes he is also secretly the director. And secretly, not only an enjoyer, but also the master, because as director, he can command anything of nature. And this is the station of the Lord, Ishvara. And then nature is no more something separate, which is playing out mechanically, but it is power of consciousness which is flowing to express what I choose to manifest out of myself. I am not only the director, I am the substance of the stage and the play, and I have a status also as spectator, but the greater and higher status is as Lord, as enjoyer and director and creator of the whole play. And nature is in that higher station, Shakti, power of consciousness to manifest, to conceive and to manifest. And you see, very smoothly, we began with this very illusory perception when I concentrate on self standing back against the relativities with an absolute gazing on relativity. You have Atman and Maya. But I have within that the station of the witness who can accept to enjoy the play of relativities, identify with them or stand back or remain free and just observe. Brings me to Purusha and Prakriti relationship where they are two separate. And from there very smoothly I recognize I can choose to refuse or to sanction or even to create. And I then awaken as Lord and power of consciousness to manifest. Now you'll see these three, Sri Aurobindo has described in this way. First, self-force of that consciousness conceptively creating all things, Maya, So it is where the measuring out in conception which creates all things. Second, it is Prakriti, nature or force made dynamically executive, working out all things under the witnessing eye of the conscious being, the self or spirit. There's a witness, and then there is this play of the force, executive. And then it is conscious power of the divine being, Shakti, which is both conceptively creative and dynamically executive of all the divine workings. So when we are, for example, daydreaming, we can say, oh, this daydream, it's all your fantasy, imagination, break out of it. Then you're dealing with it as a power which is creating, but conceptively creating. It's still a force of your consciousness that you indulged in. You stand back and say, well, I am not this. Or you can say, I choose to indulge in this, but I can stand back from it and just enjoy the possibility of imagining things, not getting entangled in it. Or I realize the whole experience is myself exploring my own creative potential. I become what I want to be in my creation, in my imagination. I am at the same time the Lord, the enjoyer, and the creator, while still enjoying objectively, while still standing back from all this. And so you see 3 degrees, and there's a continuity across them. And what Sri Aurobindo is leading us to recognize in all this is, I'm skipping one paragraph where he will distinguish further in a different way. Therefore, our integral yoga will take up these various disciplines and concentrations, but harmonize and, if possible, fuse them by synthesis which removes their mutual exclusions. Not realizing the Lord and the All only to reject them for silent self or unknowable absolute, as would be an exclusive transcendental. Nor living for the Lord alone or in the All alone, as would be an exclusive theistic or exclusively pantheistic yoga. The seeker of integral yoga will limit himself neither in his thought, nor in his practice, nor in his realizations by any religious creed or philosophical dogma. And it is this unitive totality which we must get to, where he says in the previous paragraph, our view of the world insists on unity. The universal self is not different from the perceptive and creative, nor the perceptive from the causal, nor the causal from the absolute, but it is one self-being who has become all becomings, which is none other than the Lord who manifests himself as all these individual existences. So we have here an idea of the direction in which the soul experience is moving. The first step to that is the recognition that we see both Purusha and Prakriti as expressions of the same one existence. Otherwise, we have excluded what the self does not exclude. And so, Sri Aurobindo has listed here 2 steps further beyond the conventional development of the yoga of knowledge, which would end in an illusory realization. There are 2 steps which must be taken, 2 concentrations further, which complete and bring us to this realization of a single oneness in which the world is included and at the same time transcended. So this is where we will pause for today. He now brings in the next paragraph a further distinction which is existing in the current traditions, where the Brahman is described as having 3 statuses. And that's a convenient way in which we deal with these 3 different domains of reality, these 3 different experiences, by saying Brahman himself has 3 statuses. But what is the bridge between each of these statuses? Again, there is a gap. Brahman is this, and this, and this, or this, or this, whatever form we take. But where is the continuity, the link between them? It's not obvious when we make these distinctions. So he will take up these three distinctions which are there in the tradition, recognizing them for practical purposes of a vocabulary. But in our experience, though, we must have a single movement of the divine, one manifesting all. I think we pause here and we can take up any questions, discussions, anything you want to share. It's a bit technical, but I think with the technicality, we will end the technicality here. But it is useful to recognize why this technical terminology exists, because they relate to certain real experiences. But in the vocabulary, we realize there are gaps. The experiences themselves seem to be so disparate that it is necessary to put them all in context and see their continuity and unity and experience it eventually in order to have the whole. Yes.
I can formulate a question here.
Yes.
In the third stage
Mhm.
that you described, when you are experiencing life, observing but not reacting,
Mhm.
and then you become about the person
Yes,
like,
yes.
you say the Lord and the Creator. If somebody is really a specific way right, in this state, it will affect the other people,
Hmm.
or is this who is
Yes.
from the multiple universes?
Yes. So it's an interesting question. If we are in a creative mode and we create something in our own reality, express something of our own consciousness, does it affect others? Does it affect this shared reality, or does it open out to a different universe? It depends on which consciousness is creating. So now, when I am in a daydream, I am the mind consciousness creating. And the creation, therefore, is in the mental consciousness. If you had a clairvoyant sight that saw thought forms, you would see this person in a daydream spawning forms, images, cloud-like formations, depending on clarity of his thinking, which would as if emerge and wander, which could perhaps remain accumulating around him, forming a very pretty or perhaps ugly picture, which would remain stuck in his aura and would determine his thinking patterns and therefore influence his reality and perception of the world. It would not change directly the material world, but because they're thought energies and forms, they would spread in the mental domain and influence mental world. And because others also live in mind, they would influence others' minds, which might influence their feelings and their actions, and therefore influence the material world. Okay? So, strictly speaking, anything you do should influence everything eventually, however indirectly. But in practice, because this is only a mind daydreaming and a very unformed mind, poor concentration, weak conceptive creative ability, they are mostly like cloud-like formations, like puffs of smoke, which dissipate rapidly. But a clearly articulated idea into which one has put a clear force and energy would go out and do its thing. I had a friend who was for a while experimenting with these things. He was in business. So when he had to try to attain to some object in his business, he would create strong thought formations and put them out. And he said to me later, he said, sometimes the work is now irrelevant, it's done or it's gone or it has failed, there's no possibility. A month or two later, he would find that thought formation coming back to him, impacting him and sucking energy, provoking those thoughts again. And he would wonder, where is this coming from? And then he realized it's his own thoughts which he had released into the universe for a purpose, which were now coming back because they'd exhausted their energy and were as if drawing energy from him. And so, one normally in the occult training, when they teach you to create these thought formations, they also teach you how to withdraw, reabsorb, and dissolve a thought formation. Mother narrates how Alexandra David Neal, who was her friend, she had studied in Tibet under some very advanced lamas with great mental and spiritual power. She had learned from them the capacity to create a thought formation which had a reality of its own. She called it a Mahatma. That's the vocabulary they were using then, to create a Mahatma, which means she created by imprinting with the mind a being, mental being. And of course, depending on the capacity one has, one can densify the mental being until it becomes almost like a semi-materialized being. And then she found this fellow was an irritating fellow. He kept interfering in what she was doing and advising her and telling her not to do something or telling her to do something else. And she couldn't get rid of it. She was stuck with this fellow she had created out of her own mind consciousness and so attached to her. And when she came to the mother, she was very distressed. And mother taught her how to reabsorb and dissolve that formation. But this is the way one can create a reality which, if it's weak enough, would be almost merely subjective. But if it is strong enough, has an objective character that can influence circumstances and especially oneself, to which we are tied most intensely. But this is with the mental consciousness. If now in our consciousness we have identified ourselves with the one consciousness, the one reality, and from there the creative power comes, then it acts not only on the mental plane but on all the levels that it chooses to act on. Because it is the same creative power which manifests as the universe, with which I am now identified, and therefore an action released from there will have a full impact on the whole universe. And this would be the way the supramental consciousness would act on things. In the supramental consciousness, because it is the creative power of the divine, it would act simultaneously on the whole, even when it focuses on an individual result. To lift this flower, the action itself includes the whole universe in consciousness. And as I lift this flower, its relationship with the whole is simultaneously being acted upon. And so in that whole action, in the completeness of the action, I could do things with this flower which currently are not possible from a purely material action or a purely mental or vital action. And such an intervention then would be regarded as miraculous, because it could do things which bypass the limited laws of matter or mind. So I could, for example, take this flower and in my hand will it to bloom once again. A half-faded flower could bloom once again in my hand. And it would not be anything strange for that consciousness, which was anyway the consciousness which created the flower in the first place. So yes, there would be an objective impact in the universe, which would have a character which exceeds the current limitations. So all depends on which consciousness we act from. In between, when the mind consciousness leans back on self, experiences the support of the self, its peace, its liberation, such a person in that immersion, if he or she were to speak or to act, something of that power of the self would be infused in the words or in the action. And therefore the results would also be remarkable. As you have the story of the Buddha stopping the mad elephant. So because the action itself came from a consciousness which had that power, it could have an immediate, even miraculous impact. It did not involve a physical miracle, but at the level of the mind, it had a miraculous result. So there are two concentrate again statements here, and we can just review those because these are things one can work on in our daily contemplation or meditation, which would help to bring in this completeness to our vision and experience of the universe and of the reality which transcends and yet is forming this world. So first time he says, therefore we must concentrate again and see and realize also this which persists so sovereignly, and must know the self as no other than the Supreme Soul, which is the Lord of nature, the upholder of cosmic existence, by whose sanction it proceeds, whose will compels its multitudinous actions and determines its perpetual cycles. And we must yet concentrate once again and see and realize and must know the self as the one existence who is both the soul of all and the nature of all, at once Purusha and Prakriti. I think I missed the first concentration when we were studying here. So when he says that we must know what is the secret behind this reality, the first correction he places, which I skipped to read, therefore we must concentrate again and see and realize also this which persists so sovereignly, and must know the self as no other than the Supreme Soul, which is the Lord of nature. So we see first, this self is not only our consciousness in its truth, but it is also the consciousness who is Lord of nature. And the relationship, the upholder of cosmic existence, by whose sanction it proceeds. So he upholds, he is the stage on which the whole cosmic existence plays out. Because he sanctions the play to happen, it happens. Because he sanctions the story to take this form, it is allowed to take this form. But then further deeper step, whose will compels its multitudinous actions and determines its perpetual cycles. So because he wills, all those actions begin to happen. Because he wills, there are all these rhythms of the cycles of unfolding. So you see the three steps here in the relationship. First, he is Supreme Soul, Lord of nature. Next, he is upholder of cosmic existence, by whose sanction the existence proceeds. And third, he is the will. His will compels its multitudinous actions and determines its perpetual cycles. First, sovereign and Lord. Second, upholder. And third, one who wills and makes it happen. And there we have the rhythms of nature which are formed by his will. That's why you will find in nature there are rhythms. Within the rhythms, there are rhythms. Within those rhythms, there are rhythms. We can go on in this way downwards infinitesimally. But we can equally go the other way infinitely. You take any large rhythm and you'll find it's part of a still larger rhythm, which itself is part of a still larger rhythm. Because the will which enters into the manifestation initiates from outside space and outside time. Therefore, what is outside time, when it enters time, is acting on all levels of time and across eternity. What is outside space, when it enters space, is acting on all scales of organization, large and small, infinite and infinitesimal, and across the totality of the universe. And because what enters is thus everywhere at the same time, there is a cohesiveness to the whole universe. This part matches that part. Everything is in relation with everything else because it is one consciousness which is entering, forming, and rhythmically manifesting its will. At the same time, supporting the space in which the rhythms of the will are being expressed. And it is at the same time the Lord who is enjoying from outside as well as from within. And so this is the first concentration that we have to bring in. So we see two statuses. This one who is pouring himself to create all these manifestations is in them. And then the second concentration is to recognize he is both this and that, the Purusha and the Prakriti, the Lord and power of consciousness, the Shakti. And he is at the same time both, which completes the fullness of the experience of the divine, one divine reality manifesting to become everything. So these two ideas, two concentrations, we can consciously take up even as exercises and see how they change our perspective of things. So practically, the first exercise would be like this, that when you look at something, let's say you stand before the beach, the ocean, you see this vast play of the waves. You can put your attention on the bubbles which fizzle out. They appear, they burst, fizzle out. Or the waves. And the waves themselves are part of larger ripples, of larger waves, larger movements, rhythms, cycles, which are part of tidal cycles, which are part of other cycles of flow of the water evaporating and coming back as rain, and all these movements. And who is presiding over all this? Who is Lord of all this? The divine. And you turn to the divine and say, oh, you are the creator. You have expressed all these. Then you dwell on the idea, he is not only standing above all this, he is inside all these supporting. The wave is possible because there is a base which is solid against which the wave can move. The bubble can form against the backdrop of something which is unchanging. And he's supporting all this from inside, universally and immanent inside. And then finally, we realize that it is he inside the bubble who's forming the bubbles, bursting them, inside the wave, forming them, moving them, inside everything, and inside the whole universe in this way. You meditate on this, and you'll find after a while it becomes so vivid, so intense, that the actual superficial play becomes not so important. It is his play, his joy, his power, his knowledge, his delight, which is inside everything, which stands out. And we enter in deep communion with the divine presence. And then the correction, last step of correction, he is not only working from within these things as the consciousness who's creating all this, he is all that he creates equally, the prakriti, the energy, the force of the play, as well as the one who is seated inside enjoying. And he is everything. There's nothing which is not him. There is only that, including us. And so some meditations along these lines can be very useful to fully appreciate the import of this. Now you can see how, if one has been through an experience of some kind of a liberation, even an exclusive liberation, where I am not mind, I am not life, I am not body, I am not universe, and all this is like a illusory ripple play against the backdrop of something which is so real. If one has been through that, one could re-engage with the world in this way and would have the power of this reality experienced already returning into the experience of the world. And it could be so much more powerful. But we have this already in ourselves in some partial part, when in the mind we stand back. I am not mind, I am not life, I am not body. And as a mind observer, we see all this as a play in the divine consciousness. And then we begin to focus on these two corrections within. And we have the vividness of the divine play in the form as form. So we will continue this text on the Friday after next. As next Friday, I'll have to be out of station. And we will play a video for those who are interested. I have a lecture I had given recently in Bombay in the National Montessori Conference, where I compared Sri Aurobindo's formulation of integral education with Dr. Maria Montessori's formulation of the Montessori method of education, and also shared their relationship, their communication between them. It's a very interesting theme. For those who are interested, it will be worthwhile. We'll show that on Friday next, but Sundays we will have as in continuity without a break. Oh.